Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Devil's Advocate. This is Han Yang. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome journalist Timothy McLaughlin. He's based in Singapore, previously in Hong Kong. Hello, Tim.
Hey, how are you? Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks for joining. This is an interesting role reversal because previously, a few years back, you interviewed me for your article for The Atlantic. So now,
I did, yes.
Now I'm returning the favor. So, okay, thanks for joining. Okay,
yeah,
so
of course.
So the main topic is Hong Kong, because you've been based in Hong Kong for quite a few years. How long were you in there?
About 5 years, I think, all in. Yeah. So yeah, I arrived in 2018, and then through the protests and through COVID. So yeah, I think 5 years about all in.
Okay, and you and with your wife you co-wrote a book about the Hong Kong democracy movement called Among the Braves.
Yes.
And in your book, you describe the national security law as being about control, but not calming the situation. But let's put it in China's perspective. Beijing would say that the law worked, that the protests are over and the business continues, and Hong Kong is still the major financial center in Asia. Isn't Hong Kong's stability a legitimate goal, and didn't China achieve the goal?
Yeah, I think it's a legitimate goal. I think there could be ways that would have calmed down or ended the protest that didn't go as far as the national security law, as far as some of the bits of Article 23 that we've seen imposed, and kind of the depth and length of the crackdown. So I think there was ways to resolve the issue and to bring back calm, if that was really what the government wanted. That wouldn't have been quite as extensive or draconian as the way that Hong Kong decided to pursue it.
In the book, your subjects all paid a heavy personal price. Looking back, do you think the protest movement made a strategic mistake by refusing to negotiate with China? Did the maximalism of the movement accelerate the very crackdown it feared?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think what we could take from the movement, or one of the lessons, I think, is sort of, there was a lot of emphasis on it being sort of decentralized and kind of without formal leadership. I think that proved to be a good thing in some situations, right? It sort of allowed the momentum to morph and move in different ways, and probably allowed for the movement to continue on as long as it did. But it does come with some shortcomings, and I think one of those was the fact that there was no, the development or finding kind of off ramps is very difficult. I heard that was something I heard from Beijing politicians, from diplomats, or other people, that they weren't really sure who to get in touch with or who to kind of, be in contact with, right? And I think in that void, sometimes people stepped in who proclaimed themselves to be kind of like speaking for the movement or being part of it, or being able to kind of pull the strings that certainly weren't. So yeah, I think it is an interesting study. And your question kind of points us out, is this studying kind of like the benefits, but also the limitations of a movement that doesn't have a centralized leadership. And I think it's probably something that people are looking at, who study this kind of stuff, is kind of like the benefits, but also what negatives come along with that.
The Hong Kong officials and some business figures argue that the Western media, including yourself, have framed the protest in a way that inflamed the situation and gave protested some false hope of international intervention. How do you answer that charge?
Yeah, I think I can see where it came from. I don't think it's true to myself. I think I was like in my, in the reporting and the writing of the book and the stuff up to that, I think my, colleague, Shivani, and myself were quite, clear that the Trump administration didn't really care all that much about, the Hong Kong protesters. I think there was people around Trump in his first administration who have personal connections to Hong Kong, who did care a lot about Hong Kong. I don't think Trump himself cared much at all. And so I think those advisors and those people around him had some degree of influence on this. But I think it was always sort of misleading. And I think many more people are realizing this now in democracy movements or protest movements globally, is that the US is a very unreliable partner when it comes to international support or international help, right? And so I know your question wasn't specifically about the US, but obviously I think that was the one that kind of drew the most attention at the time. And so I think we did see some things from Trump towards the end, like the sanctions and the Hong Kong Policy Act changes. But there was certainly a whole lot more that could have happened. So I think you see this in Hong Kong, and then you see it playing out more now during the Trump administration, is the dangers of being reliant on the US or the West writ large to come and like assist and help. And I think that's going to be like a big challenge for movements globally, is kind of how do you address that, and where do these where does this kind of stuff, not just movements like this, but like NGOs and democracy work, and like where did all of this go now that we're kind of in this new paradigm?
There are some speculation that in the upcoming trip to Beijing, Trump might ask for the release of Jimmy Lai as kind of asking as a bargaining chip. Do you think it's likely to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I will profess to have no sort of like reporting or insider knowledge on that. I think it's interesting. I saw Richard Lloyd Perry's piece. I think he wrote the one about the British and maybe Trump being involved. Again, I think if there is one person from the Hong Kong sort of movement, or just Hong Kong at large, that has stayed very much kind of on the radar, it's certainly Jimmy Lai. I think, right, his money and the network that he had has allowed him to be continuously kind of put in the spotlight, and also very deep connections with the Republican establishment in DC and in other parts of the US, right? Trump has certainly promised to do this. He told Hugh Hewitt that he was going to do it before he was elected, though I think if you listen back to some of those discussions with Hugh Hewitt, I'm not 100% sure that Trump knew exactly like who he was talking about, or he seemed to kind of having it coached along there. Yeah, I mean, I would say nothing is impossible. I would be, I guess, surprised, but perhaps not shocked. I do think that you see Hong Kong continuing to move against Jimmy Lai, seizing his building recently, moving to seize all of his assets. At some point, I'm assuming they're going to come for, his house and all this other stuff. And just how much Beijing and Hong Kong blame him for the issues and the problems, not just 2019, but their kind of perceived issues for a long time. Yeah, I mean, he's very much sort of an enemy of the state. So I would be, again, surprised, not totally shocked, because things happen every day at this moment that are kind of confounding and surprising. But I'm certainly interested to see how that plays out. I mean, we do know, there was reporting out there from Reuters, but I heard it myself from people in the White House that Trump did raise Jimmy Lai, or he was raised. His case was raised with Xi Jinping when they at some point previously. So yeah, it's certainly an interesting one to watch.
Well, the one country, two system framework was always set to expire in 2047. So isn't it possible that Beijing simply accelerated the timeline this time, rather than breaking the promise, and that the West, and including everybody involved here, are too naive to ever believe in the arrangement?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two parts to that, right? I think 2047 was pre-2019 was this super, fixated on this date and what would happen. Now, to me, its importance has diminished in my mind, because we've already seen all of this stuff happen in Hong Kong. And so I think that it kind of, the bleed and kind of the changes that are going on in Hong Kong that are making it sort of like more like the mainland anyway, that it sort of erodes the importance of 2047 to me in a way, right? Like, it won't be this massive like snap break from one system to the next, right? Like, it's already sort of melding together, not just the legal system, certainly the integration, in terms of physical integration with the northern metropolis that's going to get built, with the amount of talent passes that have brought in mainlanders. If you just travel around Hong Kong now, I think it's very much a different city than it was pre-COVID essentially. So in a sense, it's sort of, again, I think it's just a less important date than it was 5 years ago. And not to say it's not, of importance, but I think it is just less important than it was. And then in terms of your second part was about about the one
West.
country, two systems.
What, are we too naive to ever believe in that promise?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think some people would argue that. I think there's some people like, Emily Lau and many other commentators and politicians who had severe doubts about this from the beginning, right? Who said that this was never going to be upheld. I think there's other people who think that it was the best available deal at the time in 1984 when the basic law, when all this stuff was going on in the negotiations, that this was the best, deal that the UK and the people of Hong Kong were going to get. I think the naivety or maybe the feelings about it faded a little bit over the years because, the worst case scenario didn't play out in 1997, right? Like, Hong Kong didn't kind of collapse and fall apart and get kind of run over by the mainland or something. Like, things did continue on fairly unchanged for a while. And so maybe that kind of, I think, tempered some people who then saw the original proclamations as being quite alarmist and perhaps shifted too much the other way to kind of being too sort of accommodating to some of the things that the encroachments that Beijing was having on Hong Kong.
Looking back, the framework was always a compromise, also as a reflection of the power balance at the time. Is it because China, when the deal was made in the 80s and early 90s, China was relatively still a poor country at that time, a developing country. Now, 40 years on, China is the second largest economy in the world. And if you're taking a realist view of international relations, China's influence is bound to grow in Hong Kong, and it's bound to exert its authority on Hong Kong. That's just a natural projection of its power.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I agree with you. I think there was just a maybe a belief they kind of wrapped into that view of China at the time around the WTO and around that it was, and I should say it's held by sort of two groups of people, right? It was held by, I think, the kind of many people in the international community, if I want to use that term, in the West, thinking that China was going to sort of democratize and come into these trade agreements and change its governance structures and change the way that it operated, which wasn't unlike many of the early pro-democracy pro-democracy advocates, in Hong Kong, right? I mean, people forget that Martin Lee was also a big champion of the WTO, right? I mean, he believed, he went to Bill Clinton had him, kind of pitch it to people, right? I mean, he believed as well, I think, that that China could change and that Hong Kong could be a model of that change. Obviously, we see now that was not, that's not the way it's played out.
So you've written before that Hong Kong's Article 23 laws are another attempt at justifying crackdown. But let's look at it this way. Every Western liberal democracy has its own national security legislation. At what point is the critique of Hong Kong's laws a double standard?
Yeah. I mean, I think for certain people, there's a double standard involved. I would say for journalists or for people in general should be able to hold two kind of views in their mind. I think people can think that the Hong Kong, that Article 23 has a lot of bad pieces in it. And they could also, if they're from the UK, think that the UK's national security laws had a lot of bad pieces in it, or the US, has a lot of bad pieces in its, national security laws and overreach in terms of surveillance and things like that. So I think if you're pointing out, one thing and then championing it in another country, certainly the charges of hypocrisy are probably do. But I think for journalists and for other people that are looking at this and saying, I think people writing about Hong Kong, correspondents writing about Hong Kong, one of the critiques is, you don't say anything about the U.S.'s national security law. You don't say anything about, the U.K., what they're doing. Yes, because you're covering Hong Kong or you're covering Asia. It's not your job, right? I'm sure there's people at these institutions and at these newspapers or newswires or whatever who are writing stories that are critical of these things, right? And so I think that this is a conversation that has sort of devolved, especially online, to pretty much like whataboutism, and to the belief that you can only kind of think one thing is is bad, or one thing is it has a lot of government overreach, when there is in fact government overreach happening many places that should be called out and written about and talked about critically.
Over the past 40 years, China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and has built world-class infrastructure and has a very big rising middle class. Given that track record, isn't it somewhat condescending for the West and for the Western journalists to insist that China needs a Western-style liberal democracy? Isn't that China's development achievement so far, as many supporters of the Beijing regime would claim that the China model actually worked?
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of gets foisted on journalists who are generally writing about this stuff and like maybe quoting people or academics or activists who would like to see more democracy in China, and it's not their own sort of personal view, unless they're of course like an opinion columnist who's written that. So I think this is another thing that kind of gets thrown at journalists when it's not really like what they're writing about. They're kind of just trying to objectively write or find views from other people who might believe that. And so, so I think it's again kind of falls into I think the previous question is these charges of kind of hypocrisy and comparing to the West to China. I certainly think it can be done in more nuanced ways, but I do think it kind of gets flattened into this kind of meaningless debate. I don't think either country is going to wholesale adopt the other one's kind of system of governance, right? And I think and it's kind of silly to talk like that. And I also think it's silly to kind of ignore some of the things you pointed out with infrastructure, with development, with tech, with almost anything. That China has made massive leaps and great sort of achievements in all those fields. And so I think again, I think this is sort of a symptom of where the debate is at, I guess, between the two countries sometimes, that these kind of most extreme and sort of unnuanced positions are the ones that sort of get latched on by other, certainly by the governments of each country.
In your previous journalist work, you covered Chinese transnational repression in depth, including the subject of secret police stations and harassment of dissidents abroad. And in your 2025 piece in The Nation, you argue that the United States government has botched the Wang Shujun case and chased the wrong target for nearly a decade. So what do you actually mean? Who do you think should be the actual targets of the investigations?
Yeah, so I mean, in that case, I guess I wasn't speaking particularly about his case. I was saying that there has been instances where I think, these were cases, I guess, for people who are listening that might not be aware, is that the U.S. opened a lot of these cases, which were essentially kind of like FARA violations, Foreign Registry Act violations in the United States. And some of them, there was one in Boston that was dismissed, or a jury found the guy not guilty. There's a case that I wrote about in New York, which you're referencing, which the guy was found guilty, but he was never even sentenced to jail, because his mental state, I think, was totally shot. That he had doctors saying that he was suffering from dementia. And so I think with that story, what I was trying to say, again, is that these things should not be covered like blanketly as like kind of like nefarious spy cases, that there is a lot of nuance to them, and they should look at critically, and we shouldn't just take the US government's word that they have snatched up like, a James Bond or a super spy here and they're throwing him on trial, right? I think that the media should be sort of more selective and critical when looking at these these cases, and not fall into kind of like undue hype about what they really are. And so, yeah, that was just, it came out of just, I was in New York for another related case and ended up sitting in on that one for a while. And so that was just sort of some thoughts that I had on that one in particular.
Well, let's talk about the most recent case you wrote about in Wire, about the harassment of and the surveillance of the Olympic champion, the U.S. skate champion, Alisa Liu's father, Arthur Liu. Maybe tell the audience about that case.
Yeah, so there's a individual named Frank Liu who's been charged along with four, I believe, 3 or 4 other individuals in New York for a kind of rather sprawling operation to spy on and harass Chinese dissidents who were residing in the United States and also abroad. One of them was living in Thailand. And so they were dissidents in, San Francisco, California, Indiana. And there was one more whose location I can't remember. And then there was one living abroad in Thailand. And so Frank Liu, I will say allegedly, because he has not gone to trial yet. His trial is going to start probably this summer. Allegedly set up sort of a network or hired a former Marine, former U.S. Army guy to stalk these people and set up surveillance gear and kind of keep tabs on them. And he was funneling that information back to someone in Hong Kong who the U.S. government believes was working for the Chinese government. The person who did a lot of the actual spying, like on the ground and harassment, is named Matthew Zaburis. He has pleaded guilty to these charges. He is awaiting sentencing now. And so he pleaded guilty back in 2022, I believe. So I wrote about that case. It has a Hong Kong connections. Arthur Liu, escaped from China after Tiananmen through Hong Kong through through Operation Yellowbird, and came to the United States. Some of the other dissidents involved in that also have connections to Hong Kong, which is kind of how I originally got interested in the case. So that was it. I'm kind of looking forward, although I'm not sure I'll be able to make it. I'm kind of looking forward to the trial because I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff in the court documents. I think there'll be some really interesting witnesses, given that some people have already pleaded guilty. So I think it could be like a very interesting look into this kind of network and how it all operated.
But it does look from the outside, it's like it's a comically inept, low-level kind of espionage work.
Yeah.
It's not exactly James Bond level work. It's low-level harassment and surveillance.
And I think this is probably more of the 2 or 3 cases that I've kind of paid attention to and written about. This is probably the more sophisticated one, which gives you a sense of how kind of slipshod and bad the other ones were. This one did involve some like GPS trackers and some surveillance equipment. There is part of this case that is unsolved, so some people did get away with some things. But yes, as you say, I think people are, if they go into this reading about this, expecting a super sleek kind of super spy, with disguises and all that stuff. This is not that operation. I will say, again, allegedly, there was quite a bit of money involved in this. The U.S. alleges that Frank Liu was paid something like $3 billion and that Matthew Zaburis has paid something like over $150,000 from him. So there appears to be serious cash involved. But again, text messages, a lot of the stuff that's in the court documents does not paint a picture of a highly sophisticated spying operation at all.
Well, it's certainly not money well spent on behalf of the Chinese government. It's $3 million. I don't see any concrete spy result.
No. I mean, it would seem like it was a poor investment. And I think it's interesting. I think if you look at it from other ways rather than the tactics and stuff, it's kind of like the Chinese dissident community in the U.S. How people try to kind of infiltrate that community and who they think are kind of potential targets and things like that is quite that was quite interesting to learn about and to read about. But yeah, I mean, back to your original point, a lot of this stuff was like quite sort of amateurish. Although I will say that, another individual has pleaded guilty, and he was a DHS official at the time. He was looking for information in DHS employee only computer system, and was sending that stuff along. So they were getting some sort of valuable information or non-public information. But it's certainly the way that they carried it out, again, was not what someone thinks of it, I think, when they think of, Chinese super spies.
I don't know whether you're aware of this, but Arthur Liu does have an interesting backstory apart from his escape from China after the Tiananmen crackdown, because his ex-wife was involved with a very prominent Chinese Qigong kind of a network, and which there's a lot of controversy, a lot of money involved, and there's a lot of quarreling about the money and about influence peddling and about fraud. And so maybe that's another subject you can investigate for your next piece. It does have a lot of interesting background story about Arthur.
Yeah. I mean, I heard a little bit about it when I was working on the story. It wasn't the focus of it. And the Olympic stuff kind of happened later on. But yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting. I think in the diaspora community, Chinese, community in Flushing in California, there are a lot of super interesting, stories like the one that you're talking about, that generally don't get all that well covered in English media. I think more comes out in kind of Chinese media on blogs and on YouTube channels and things like that. But yeah, very interesting. I think there's a lot of, it's a fascinating world. I can't say that I understand it totally, but it was interesting, this piece, and the other piece that I did kind of gave me a brief kind of look into it. And it was very, very interesting.
If I may make another suggestion, the Falun Gong movement in the US, they have a massive financial and media network, and it's quite influential in the right-wing media, especially with their Epoch Time publications. And that's, I think New York Times does a little bit of story, but not deep enough. I think that's another story to be written, how their financial backing and how it's intertwined with the US, especially the conservative media ecosystem. And they've become very massive on Facebook and social media. I mean, they're sort of everywhere. It's sort of inescapable. I think most people, or many people, probably don't know the backstory and the connections to the movement and things like that, if they're just kind of a casual observer or reader of it, or you just come across it online. Okay, so let's talk about the China's Great Firewall. Well, it's oppressive, but on the other hand, TikTok has been nearly banned in the US, and it was forced to be taken over by US interests. And the European Union is restricting Chinese tech, and many Western governments are increasingly demanding platform compliance with state interests. So isn't the gap between China's internet control and Washington's instincts actually not as wide as we believe they are?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're still pretty wide. But we have, in the US, there's, of course, uncensored internet. I think people don't quite understand how things can just vanish online like they do in China, especially breaking news events that are negative for the party and stuff can just kind of go totally sort of unknown to many people because of how fast and how thoroughly they can be scrubbed from the web. So I think the gap is not even really a gap. It's still like an ocean-wide gulf. However, I think you touch on something there, not just with the internet, but probably more broadly in this moment with industrial controls, with AI, with tech more broadly. And I think this is a question that's coming up, in the US more and more now. And it's does the US have to become more like China to compete and to stay ahead, or to stay sort of in the race and a lot of this stuff, right? And I think that dates back probably further than this, but I think some people would point to times in the Biden administration when Jade Sullivan talked about, this era of globalization and free trade coming to an end. You see the US's weaponization or widespread use, if you want to use that term, of tariffs, as the 301 investigations, all this stuff, that people will point to and say, oh, China's been doing this for a very long time, right? So yeah, I think what you touched on is a big debate that is happening sort of, in Washington and other places in the US right now. And it's do you have to become a bit like your enemy, if you want to put it that way, to succeed.
Well, the Chinese Communist Party has governed the Chinese people, 1.5 billion people, for over 70 years without collapse, and with actually majority approval ratings, if you believe in those surveys. And the approval rating actually well above most Western governments. So is the Western liberal consensus simply wrong about how to evaluate the legitimacy of the Communist Party?
I don't know. I mean, that's a big question. I think, again, this is something that people are probably discussing and talking about in the way that they weren't before Trump. I think this has spurred a lot of conversations on, with great amount of sort of distrust, in the United States, a great distrust in its, position as a rational global actor. You see people like, even here in Singapore, the foreign minister calling the U.S. quite recently a revisionist power. So I do think that these ideas that were maybe, I don't want to say not mainstream, but maybe not talked about as much or so much in the discourse now, especially I think after the Iran war was started by the U.S., there are big discussions, I think, and legitimate discussions going on about the U.S. position in the world, and countries looking towards China for more stability or rationality. That obviously then comes with, for certain countries, the bullying and kind of coerciveness that we see from China, in Southeast Asia, where I live. Of course, it's very pronounced in the Philippines and South China Sea and other places like that. So I think this is a big question. But again, I think there's always this idea of countries kind of choosing sides or picking one country. And I always find that, again, a bit missing the mark. I don't think a country like the Philippines or somewhere else is going to one day up and say, we're going to adopt China's, system of governance, right? I mean, it's just not going to happen, right? So I think countries will kind of lean and sway and do what they have to do for their own people and benefit. But certainly those discussions and those people in answering to their own populations about the US's actions in the world are going to be, I think the questions are going to get harder for them.
Well, you mentioned the war in Iran. Let's talk about that. There were many people who argue that with the Iran war, and also before that, the capture of President Maduro, that the Trump administration actually targeting China, because both countries are quite important allies of Beijing, and Beijing has long thought a strategic relationship with Venezuela and Iran, especially in the energy field. So what do you think? Is this actually that's a grand strategy behind the war that's to target China?
No. I find that very, very, very difficult to believe. I think there is a sort of group of people, conservative commentators, online influencers, certain opinion columnists in the Trump sphere, TV talking heads, who sort of have this role of rationalizing and making Trump's actions seem like they're part of this great plan of strategy and strategicness, and it's all about China and rewriting the global order and all this stuff. And I simply do not think that is the case. I think that this is a war that, if we look at we take away the opinion writing and we look at the actual reporting from places like, the New York Times piece on the insights on this and other places, that this was a war that was, the U.S. was kind of, they wanted to jump into, Trump personally wanted to jump into, with Israel. And so I just don't think it holds water beyond people, again, trying to sort of puff themselves up in front of Trump and make Trump seem like, again, this great geostrategic, thinker and decision maker. So no, I simply find that hard to fathom.
Well, the U.S. Imposed targeted sanctions after the national security law and made some sympathetic noises about Hong Kong's democracy. But then I think they largely moved on, and especially the Trump administration, prioritizing trade deals and great power competition. So in your view, what Hong Kong's Democrats used as pawns in this geopolitical chess game, like the US playing with China, and the Hong Kong Democrats never had an actual chance of winning?
I'm not sure if they were used as pawns. I think that takes away sort of the agency of the Hong Kong people. I don't think the U.S. told them to go out on the streets and protest. I think they did it on their own, and I think they had their own ideas and their own goals and what they wanted to accomplish when they started the protest movement and as they carried it on. So I would push back on that. I don't think that is the case. I think that the U.S. could have certainly done more to be helpful to the people of Hong Kong, particularly after the NSL and things like that started to come into effect. The biggest one that I've talked about and written about would be having a more sympathetic, immigration strategy that would allow Hong Kongers to, move to the United States. People like Ted Cruz, who performatively came to Hong Kong and stood around in his black shirt, he was the guy who tossed that out. And it's yet to kind of be revived. And it seems difficult that it would be given the current animosity towards immigrants in the United States, no matter where they're from. And so I didn't think they were used, as pawns. I think, again, it was like Hong Kongers and their own agency that came out. I certainly think the U.S., for all of their sort of backing and vocalness from lawmakers and from the administration, certainly could have and should have done more to assist them once things started looking the way they did, because the U.S. can try to predict, and I'm sure there's analysts and intelligence people who do this all day, sort of how they can change Beijing's actions, and I'm sure that's what they want to do with the sanctions and things like that. But they can never be sure of the changes that they will cause, whereas they can control their own government. They are the U.S. government, so they can make decisions and they can do things of their own volition that would have made life easier for many Hong Kongers.
Under the second Trump administration, the U.S. has kind of pulled back from the global promotion of democracy. And some have argued that U.S. democracy promotion was always hypocritical anyway, because U.S. has a history of supporting authoritarian regimes when it's convenient or in the U.S. interest. So does the collapse of American moral authority actually simplify the global picture? Or does it make things worse for Hong Kong activists, the one described in your book?
Yeah, I think we go beyond Hong Kong. I think when you look at this, it's not just, this narrow focus on democracy. It's the entire ecosystem around this type of stuff, right? It's like USAID, it's like public health, it's all the things that that Trump, the administration has cut and done away with. It's, VOA, RFA, language services, all that kind of stuff, right? So all of that sort of broad sphere of soft power has essentially vanished, right? And so I think all of that is bad, not just for Hong Kong, but for people globally, and also not just pro-democracy or liberal-minded people or progressive people. Those were kind of in a way sort of global public services that were offered to anyone, right? I mean, if you could read VOA or listen to RFA, no matter what your political leanings were. I think the other thing is this stuff is probably not coming back. I know there's a lot of people saying like, oh, when Trump's out of office, like this stuff will be restored, or these could come. And I don't believe that's true. I think it's very easy to kind of dismantle things and tear them down in DC. I think it's very, very, very hard to get them built up again and running again. And so I'm pretty down on that whole thing. And I think the moral authority of the U.S. Is certainly at a low point. I think other people will point, to the Iraq War, in the Bush time when many Americans will remember, I guess, traveling abroad and especially Europe and being, told not nice things or told to go home and things like that. Even then, Congress had supported that action. So we're really kind of in uncharted, territory at the moment in terms of kind of what Trump's doing and what it will do to the U.S. Standing. And that's not just the war. We're also talking about, the trade stuff and everything else.
Australia and Britain and Canada, they all have given refuge to many Hong Kong Democrats and exiles. But those same governments also have massive economic interest in trading with China. How do you see the balance that those countries adopt in those relationship with China while trying to support the democracy movement while maintaining a healthy economic relationship?
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard one. I think, you see it in the UK now, they're balancing, you have all these new citizens from Hong Kong or soon to be citizens who have very strong strident views about China and who are in a place where they can, voice them out. So you are dealing with a new sort of demographic that wasn't there before. And it's pretty sizable in the UK. And if you look at like the local level, it could be very kind of powerful kind of voting block. I've been around to some of these towns and areas where a bunch of people have resettled from Hong Kong in the UK, and it's quite interesting to see how they're swaying the local dynamics already with people getting elected to office, and you have some Hong Kongers winning local seats. And I think then in those positions, obviously they're not just focused on China; they're focused on a lot of things. But yeah, it is quite interesting to see. I think there's inevitably going to be some probably disappointment amongst some of the more strident activist types who move to these countries and would like to see their governments take a harder line, only to find out that that's not going to be the case, at the moment. So yeah, I think it's a lot of sort of expectations and kind of reality checks, but then also I think they, again, I'm more familiar with the US and the UK. You do have sort of a new group of people who are, agitating and pushing for things on Capitol Hill, in local places as well. So yeah, I mean, I find it kind of dynamic and super interesting, and I'm interested to see kind of, how it plays out in other places. My district counselor who used to represent my area in Hong Kong when I first lived there, yeah, he was elected to a seat in the UK now. So, I mean, it's pretty wild to think that you could have people that served, in the district council in Hong Kong that are, now taking up spots over the UK.
Well, your book is subtitled "The Future of Global Democracy," but as you mentioned, the global democracy is retreating, and arguably, especially in the United States. So,
Yeah.
does the story of Hong Kong tell us something irreversible about the trajectory of global democracy?
I think it tells us a lot about how quickly things can change, and how systems can be corroded, and how guardrails can very quickly kind of fall apart. And I have these thesis that like how people will go along with this stuff. And I'm not even saying that I'm saying that in two ways. Go along with it in terms of the people who actively promoted it, in terms like whether it's kind of pro-Beijing lawmakers or like KOLs or all those people who are very for these changes. But then on the other hand, the kind of people who go along with it in the sense that they continue on their day-to-day life, maybe working as a civil servant in the government or something like that, who maybe don't agree with it totally or fully, but then have to continue on their life. Maybe they've got kids or maybe they've got things, right? Not everybody can move. Not everybody wants to move. So I think, those are the things that I kind of take away and think about now. And I think, I think the US is a good example where they're realizing like how fast this stuff can happen. And people say, oh, Trump be president for 4 years. There's so many guardrails, there's checks and balances and all this stuff. And like, look how fast some of this stuff has happened. Right. And so I'm kind of constantly again amazed by the longevity and the and kind of the resilience of the protest movement in Hong Kong and how long and how big it went on for. I think the thing that comes comparable to me that I thought had some similarities was the anti-ICE protests in Minnesota, where they seem to kind of be from the ground up and very kind of focused on people using their strengths to protest in certain areas and things like that. But certainly, I think when we look at global democracy at the moment, it's pretty bleak. And I think we also have to admit that some democracies are the ones that are the bad actors. I mean, look at the US, right? Democracy. So I don't think being a democracy, obviously, makes you infallible or kind of perfect from this stuff.
You've covered the misuse of force by the Hong Kong police in your reporting, but the protesters at the time also committed some violence. They attacked people they suspected of being pro-Beijing, and some business run by the mainland Chinese were especially targeted And does that kind of violence justify the crackdown? I mean, in the United States, the rioters did attack the Capitol, and over 1,000 of them were actually prosecuted and jailed. So in that sense, doesn't those violent protests deserve to be punished in Hong Kong, and those violent actions?
Yeah, so I think there's two things. I think there's one, violence against kind of people. That's one thing that we're talking about that you touched on there. I think the guy getting lit on fire, like there's some other very ugly instances. Of course, everyone remembers the guy getting tied up and beaten at the airport, and some other times through the Hong Kong protests that turned very violent and sort of troubling, without a doubt. The other stuff, the vandalism, I think I would put that sort of in my mind, or if I was thinking about it into a sort of a slightly different, bucket, I guess. And I think sometimes, again, the media and other people can kind of conflate the two of them. And I do think that there is a difference between physically harming someone and lighting them on fire, or beating someone till they pass out, and like breaking a window. And so I think we need to be careful when we talk about, violence, vandalism at protest movements, and sort of like looking at it, the big picture of the gradients of what was going on. So that's one part of it. The second part I think that you touched on is the use of force. Yeah, certainly. And like you said, in Hong Kong, tens of thousands of, 10,000 plus, or I'm not sure the number off the top of my head anymore, of people, were arrested for offenses at the protests, including, violence. A lot of them went to jail. A lot of them, went to these rehabilitation programs, some of them secret now we're hearing about. But there are still, to my knowledge, no police officers who were ever charged for misuse of force, right? So that's the difference, right? People say, oh, the protesters used force. Yes, they did. Some of them were violent, and they got arrested, and they got charged, and some of them had their lives upended and ruined. Police officers did the same thing, and they got away with it. Even though, as we showed in our reporting, that they were breaking their own rules, right? So I think that is the difference. When we're equating the state and people, protesters, as equals, then that argument is from its start flawed.
The pro-Beijing people would argue that in the United States, the state ICE agents who killed 2 protesters, and they were never investigated or never charged. So the U.S. doesn't really have a moral high ground.
Yeah, also, but I mean, again, I'm not talking about the U.S. I'm talking about myself and journalists, and there's plenty of journalists who have written, again, critically about the decision and have shed light on how it came to be. So yes, also, again, what I went back to is you can think more than one thing is bad. You can think 2 things in 2 different countries are inappropriate and unacceptable.
Do you think the Western, this is a common complaint from the pro-Beijing propaganda, that the Western media downplayed those violence against properties and against other people during the protest movement? Do you think it was downplayed by the international media reporting?
No, not at all. I mean, I think there's hundreds of hours of footage out there of fires, of broken windows, of people breaking into LegCo, of all that stuff. There's, anyone can look back and read back on the coverage, and I think we'll from major reputable organizations, and find it to be, I think, balanced in the way that they described what was going on. I think there's no person that I know wrote about the protests and said they were, totally peaceful and there was no issues and things like that.
So now you're in Singapore, and you've lived in both Hong Kong and Singapore. So it's 2 very different Asian cities, but yet somehow similar, because Singapore is also authoritarian by most liberal standards. Yet Singapore is very stable, prosperous, and largely admired in the West. So does living in Singapore change how you think about the relationship between freedom and governance?
No, not really. I mean, I think that the main difference is, Singapore's a country, and Hong Kong is not. And so, and Hong Kong is, part of a bigger country that's China. And so I think there are attempts to draw a lot of parallels between the 2 places, that again, I think miss the point. And I think there are things that are you could be critical about, here and also in Hong Kong. But I think there's always this, I guess, because they both serve as sort of like financial centers, and there's a lot of international representation in both places, that they have served as this kind of comparison point with each other for a long time. I don't think it's totally like accurate in the way that they are kind of held up against each other. And again, I think the main difference is one is a country with a sovereign country with its own government, and the other one is not.
After the Hong Kong protest movement, there was suggestion or talk about the declining status of Hong Kong as a international financial center because of the security crackdown. And there was a suggestion that Singapore might overtake Hong Kong to replace Hong Kong as the regional financial center. Has that happened?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think what happened was, post COVID, Hong Kong was a really bad spot. I think that the recovery that Hong Kong has seen has been sort of turbocharged by the U.S. And by the trade war and by a number of other factors that the U.S. government has done that has allowed Hong Kong to capitalize on its position. And I think that Trump, Hong Kong should be thanking Trump because he has done a lot of things that have driven capital and companies and people to Hong Kong. I mean, most recently, of course, bombing Iran. I mean, you see all these stories about people leaving, places like the Middle East and Dubai and looking at Hong Kong again. And that's just one of many examples, I think, of Trump's policies that have been hugely beneficial to Hong Kong in terms of its financial status, right?
So the Hong Kong model was promoted to Taiwan as the path to a peaceful reunification. So that model has basically been discredited now. So does the fate of Hong Kong make a military confrontation over Taiwan more likely?
I'll say I don't know. I mean, I will say that certainly Hong Kong and what happened in Hong Kong erased for people in Taiwan the idea that one country, two systems was applicable, right? Maybe it will come back. Maybe in 20 years they'll be talking about it again. Maybe it won't be. I'm not sure. But I think now, or at least even in the last election, certainly the 2019, the election that took place during the Hong Kong protests, and the election I think after that, even the KMT's position was to kind of distance itself from one country, two systems, right? It really became sort of a toxic idea given what had happened in Hong Kong. And in terms of kind of how that impacts the future of Taiwan, it's an interesting question, but I'm not totally sure, and I'm not sure anyone is certain about where Taiwan stands, and more importantly, where Xi Jinping thinks Taiwan stands.
With the U.S. being distracted now in Iran, having its resources diverted to the Middle East, well, there were two kind of talk. One, the hawkish voices on China suggest that this sets an example to China that the U.S. is determined to project its power anywhere in the world and not afraid to use its military power to achieve its goals. And another side of the argument is probably more pro-Beijing voices would suggest that the way the U.S. conduct its war, like 2 months, nearly more than 2 months into the war, the U.S. hasn't subdued Iran, which shows that the limited capacity of the U.S. military power to achieve its strategic goals, and that can kind of help China in a way that prove that the U.S. is unable to project its power far away from its homeland. So what do you think the impact of the Iran war on the possible future conflict over Taiwan? Does the U.S. has the capacity to actually help defend Taiwan, given what we have seen over the war of Iran?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll just talk to the reporting that I've seen, right? That the U.S. has certainly used down a lot of its munitions and a lot of its weaponry, and it's been sort of course, moving things out of Asia towards the Middle East, whether it's kind of naval units, but also I think again missile systems and things like that. one would think that that would certainly, make people, the government of Taiwan, nervous about its defense in terms of the U.S. But I think probably something else that's less kind of geopolitical and strategic is what's happening in Iran and in the U.S. war against Iran tell us about people's feelings towards the U.S. getting involved in a conflict over Taiwan. I'm not convinced many Americans would want the U.S. involved. I'm not convinced many Americans would really care. And I think a lot of people now, have grown so tired of the U.S. being out in the world that they would think that this is a small island. It's a million miles away from the U.S. and we don't really care. And maybe, and some of them will probably say maybe it should be part of China, right? So I think that there is sort of a lessening sympathy amongst the American population, perhaps, for anything that is happening in the wider world. I think the U.S. right now is exceedingly inward-looking, and the U.S. population is exceedingly inward-looking, even from, I think that really started kind of during COVID and has continued. So yeah, I mean, the one thing that I kind of think about or look for answers on, or things, is like, what does the American population feel about this, and would they care? You have some people like Silicon Valley types, I think, constantly saying, right, that the U.S. should hurry up and start building its own chip factory, so we don't have to get the U.S. I shouldn't say we. So the U.S. doesn't have to get involved in anything with Taiwan. That it could just be lost to China and wouldn't impact the U.S. Chip flow, right? So I think, and I don't think that is a sort of one person's opinion. I think that is fairly widespread. And I think people in Taiwan, and I went to a talk in there maybe during the last election, I can't remember when this came up, but I think when people mistake the United States talking about Taiwan for caring about Taiwan people. And in my feeling, they don't care that much at all about them. They care about the strategic position of Taiwan. They care a lot about the chips. The people of Taiwan, I don't think they really care that much about. And they care about U.S. interests, right? And so I think that is something that I think people should probably keep in mind and kind of think about a little bit as this thing drags on in Iran.
Well, I'm sure President Xi Jinping will be very happy to hear that.
Yeah, perhaps if he's listening, maybe.
All right. Well, I think that covers our topics. So thanks
you very
much
for having me. Yeah, thanks for having me. I very much appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Have a good night.
Okay, have a good night.